So about a month ago, I got to take what I consider a lifelong bucket list. I was able to go with a group of about 20 other attorneys to Amsterdam, and we went to the Hogeweyk Village, which sometimes people call the Dementia Village, which is located just about 10 minutes outside of downtown Amsterdam. And the idea of this village is basically to totally take away all that we think about in institutionalized care. And in fact, quite honestly, when we were there, we learned that they actually had an institution, a large building that was, multi-floors and had a nursing home there, and they tore it down. And they decided to put a village there and care for those same people, nursing home level people, in a village environment. And the idea behind it is when you take away risk, you take away life. I'm going to say that again. When you take away risk, you take away life. It was so amazing to be able to actually see it. I'm never going to be able to do it justice. We're never going to be able to do it justice on this podcast, but to be able to see it, to see people who, in the U.S. would be in locked dementia units, see them living their lives was simply amazing. So I'm Julie Steinbacher, and my daughter and I, Cortney's a CPA, but we started this podcast, Hey Woman, as really a tribute to my mom, who we used to say, Hey Woman, when we walked in and talked to her. We both had the opportunity to go to the Dementia Village and meet with Eloy, one of the founders, and also Iris, who wasn't one of the original founders, but it's just amazing individual. Everybody that we met there was wonderful and amazing. And I'm the president of the $1 Million Solution, which is a coaching group that lets estate planning and elder law practices really have the lives and practices that they deserve. It's also very much forward thinking. How can we do it better? How can we do it better in this time as times change? And so I personally coach many attorneys across the nation about their practices. If you're looking for any of those attorneys that you want help from, there is a website, planningandprotecting.com, and that's a website that I've created and is able to have you get in touch with people who are like-minded in what I do. But important thing is, we were able to go to and see. We spent 2 days there and then a half a day kind of debriefing with the other attorneys and social workers and people from law offices to kind of think about how could we, maybe if as elder law attorneys, maybe we're not building a place, but how could we take what we learned there and bring it back to our clients and make the journey better for them? And whether what they were dealing with was dementia or another diagnosis, like in my mom's situation, it was a restrictive lung disease. My stepdad's situation, it was congestive heart failure. But how can we make that better? And I don't know about you, Court, but I was so amazed and came home with so much more than I even thought, even though this was a bucket list and I couldn't wait to go.
And I think, for me, I didn't know what I thought it was going to look like when I got there. So when you hear the buzzwords, you hear Dementia Village, is what a lot of us, would call it when we were going.
Which Eloy hates that we call it that because it's really highlighting the dementia part and not the person.
Right.
And we all have to be conscious of that. We don't want to say a dementia patient. We want to say someone who has dementia. So we want to be really focused on the person first.
And I think, that theme was really spread throughout the entire village. And so, but when we use the word village, it was so hard for me to understand. And I had the misnotion when I got there that these were patients in an earlier diagnosis of dementia. But they weren't. These were what we would consider in the U.S. nursing home level care. These are advanced dementia patients, or patients who have a diagnosis of dementia, right? We have to, the languaging is so important, but it really was a village. And so I want people to kind of imagine it, although it's so hard without actually seeing it. But you walk through the doors into like this beautiful open courtyard. And the residents live in like little houses. There's about 7 of them. And, they kind of sort people in these houses based on the way that they lived their lives and the way that they grew up. And so, while these people may not have anything in common with each other, they have different similarities in the way that they eat food and the way that they like to spend their days and in all of these different things. And so it creates a neat environment because they have this underlying thing that they have in common with each other. But there's also, even the way that they think about how they present activities and different things like that was so neat, like the clubs that they're joining, and there were restaurants and all of this stuff. And, you hear from so many different caregivers and families and support systems. And when you walked into these like locked dementia units, you're kind of just like looking at your loved one.
Right.
But here it was a whole experience, and they
were living.
They were living.
Mm-hmm. They were living a life. They were.
Which was so different. And some of what we learned there, gosh, Mom, was so simple.
It really was. And I think I've seen it be attempted to be replicated in the U.S. I've certainly went to places, facilities, and please know I'm sure that they exist. But in my experience, the ones that I went to in the U.S., the big difference is they were kind of pretending.
Yeah.
And it was just simply that they were allowing these people to live. So they created an environment in a village where they were living their life. And there's some of that is, you talked about 7 people in a house and getting up in the morning, and we're going to decide what we're going to eat for lunch. And not everybody has to go. And of course, not everybody wants to go, but some people, they're going to go to a supermarket that's an actual little supermarket where they're going to actually buy the food that they're going to then take back, and they're going to prepare that meal for the people in that house. And some of the people are going to help prepare that meal. So it's not a pretend supermarket. It's a real supermarket where they're actually going and buying this stuff. And they're going to make those meals. And, people are going to be able to walk around. And there's a pub. And it's an actual pub. You can go in and get a drink. And if your family comes, you can go in together. And there's a restaurant. And again, an actual restaurant. We ate there.
It was really good.
It was. But, if I'm visiting my loved one, I could take them to a restaurant right there in that village. They really believe that without risk, there's no life. And you see that in the way they even think about people falling.
I think for me, that was one of like the biggest mindset shifts. So I remember somebody in the group, they asked that question before we went out and toured it. They were like, well, what happens if they fall? And Eloy was just kind of like, well, people fall. And I was just like, well, yeah, but because I think for me, like when Nan would fall, it was this thing.
Yes.
It was such you're like, oh my gosh, we're like putting her in an ambulance and we're taking her to the emergency room. Like we've talked about it on here before. Like her falling was such a big deal. And I think for them.
And it was if we had done something wrong or she had.
Yes. And there was blame to be laid. But there it was just kind of like, well, we get them medical attention, and like they had people there that could look at them, so they weren't sending people out. No, please no. I'm sure if somebody needed, an X-ray or like it was a really bad fall, but some of it in like the way then that we would like walk around. For some people, they had like little weights like on their feet, and that was to make walking safer. So it wasn't like it was just like a free for all. Like when we talk about like with no risk, they took specific measures to reduce those risks without just like setting them in a chair and asking them to like bubble wrapping them and asking them not to move, right? They were like, how do we make sure that these people can still walk around? And so they'd put weights on them to signal to the brain that they were walking. And so, and it was just kind of more of an accepted risk that they might fall. but they were going to fall at home too. And so it doesn't mean that anything is wrong, and it doesn't mean that we want people to fall and break their hip, because that can be really catastrophic. But thinking about how do we reduce risk without reducing life? And I think even when I think it's a fundamental shift in, when we were walking around, somebody broke a glass. And this seems like such a small thing, but it wasn't really like even noted. Like, so they used glass cups and plates and different things like that. We would never here in the U.S.
My goodness, if that had happened here, we would have been like, we have to get rid of them. We can't be using, glass anymore. We have to, have plastic, yeah.
Right? They just cleaned it up.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, so what is the risk of using glass? So somebody drops it, they break one, they just buy a new one. They clean it up. It wasn't this big production. There weren't 4 workers. They didn't make the person feel bad because it really wasn't their fault. Like, please know, I've broken a glass or two.
Yes, you have.
Unloading the dishwasher, you know what I mean? So, like, it really is, when we think about reducing risk, we want to really think about, like, what are we reducing? And if we're reducing a risk, what's actually the worst thing that can happen?
Yeah, and I would say Eloy and Iris would even go farther to say, when we in the U.S. try to reduce risk, like we put them in the bubble wrap, we actually maybe make it more likely that they fall because we're constantly waiting on them. We're bringing things to them, and then they're not continuing to use their muscles and continuing to walk. So when they go to do it less often, they're maybe weaker and they're more likely to. So like, I think, and I don't want to speak for Eloy and Iris, but one of the things that I got out of it was the bubble wrap's not working anyways. You know what I mean? So
Nan would still fall.
Right.
So maybe let her walk, let her keep the muscles strong.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, and I know that, this is a mindset shift. As an owner of a facility in Pennsylvania, if somebody falls, we have to report it to the state. That's where some of that blame comes from,
right?
Is like, oh, something bad happened. And please know, of course, we have to have ways to make sure people are getting good care. But I think, what it really taught me was to kind of really take a step back and say, all of what we're doing to try to help people or protect them might be protecting them from one thing, but it's opening them up to something else. And at the end of the day, we're taking away life. We're taking away their ability to live. And that's, an injustice, because it's no fun living in bubble wrap,
No, and I think sometimes, we talk about behaviors so often. They're like, this person has a diagnosis of dementia, they have behaviors. And I'm not saying that, people, even Eloy and Iris would say that residents of the Hogeweyk have behaviors too, but they're just kind of a normal part of the way that person sorts the world. And they're more equipped to handle it because, one, maybe the behaviors aren't as pronounced because they're living as normal of a life as possible.
When they're walking around and they're getting tired, so they're more likely to want to sleep at night.
Yeah, and I think that's such a big one that, like, especially, when we think about, like, caregiver technologies and things like that, so many people want to know, like, the minute that their loved one is getting out of bed because they could fall on the way to the bathroom. Like, I remember that being a really big thing with Nan is, if she had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, like, she could fall. And so, like, how do we make sure that, like, people know that she's getting up or different things like that? What was interesting over there, they didn't have somebody in the house overnight. There was a team of 7, and they knew who maybe would need more help than others. They really got to know the person. And those that were sleeping through the night, they were sleeping through the night because they had done things during the day, which I think is so important. We think about they're not sleeping and there must be something wrong. And so, we go straight to medication.
Right.
When maybe if they were more active during the day, or maybe you could use something other than medication. Maybe we could use a weighted blanket or, something like that. Like maybe there's alternatives to turn, and not that the medical community, not that we shouldn't turn to medicine and not that the medical community is not great, but maybe there are other things that will allow them to continue to live as normal of a life without all the side effects and the risks and other things that come from that.
Well, I mean, sometimes with the behaviors, we add a medicine that might actually make them unsteady on their feet, you know. And one of the things that Eloy talked about is that the average person in the U.S. who's kind of in the same situation is on 16 medicines, and over there it's 4. So, I mean, there's real, like, we can sit here and talk about the fact that we thought it was great, but more importantly, the data that they've shown from the years of having it show that it is a better outcome. You know, there's less medicines. They show a graph of like how people go through a diagnosis and knowing that, you know, here is like this steady decline, but there, like, people are okay and then they just pass away. And so they have less days of really being, you know, not able to live life. And so, you know, for me, I left with there really knowing that very simple, let people live, but also really, really impactful and working. And so one of the things that we did as a group of people is we had a debriefing. And what we tried to do is to say, okay, even if I'm not going back and, you know, building a facility, what can we as elder law attorneys offer to our clients as real actionable advice? Like, what are the things that we think people should be able to do? And I think, you know, the first one of those is including your loved ones in everyday activities. So grocery shopping, cooking, folding clothes, setting the table, getting their hair done. And I think sometimes as caregivers, we try to get all this stuff done for them so that it's done. And then they're sitting there waiting for us. And this model would be, you know, include them in it. You're making dinner, have them cut things up. You know, that was one of the things Eloy was like, yeah, we let them have a knife, you know. And
which, like, you know, you watched all of us sitting there, like, kind of like take a step back. We're like, what do you mean they have a knife? Like, right. And we're talking about real knives, right?
Right,
like,
yeah.
They're cutting potatoes, right? Like, and so, but I think, you know, we inject sometimes artificial activities. So, you know, we send them out to go play bingo. And please know, I'm not knocking bingo. I think
I like bingo, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's a good, you know, social activity. Or, you know, they put up these Wiis and they go Wii bowling or different things like that, which is always a little bit funny to me to think about, like, all of these, like, people who maybe didn't grow up with technology trying to, like, Wii bowl.
Though I would say there's some people at Nipponose Valley Village who could beat younger kids at Wii bowling. They got quite good.
They have. But I think, you know, for Nan, she would rather have folded her own laundry. Like, she wouldn't have been caught dead Wii bowling. That's for sure.
No.
But if you wanted to talk about how she wanted to fill her day, making decisions about dinner, folding her laundry was really important to her. Cooking, dusting.
Yep.
And so these everyday things that we did kind of around her, she may have rather have been a part of. Or I even think about, you know, it was really important to her when she moved out there so she had, like, there was like a side entrance and she went in and out there mostly because she didn't, like, she was too cool to use the front entrance. She didn't want people to know where she was going. But it was really important to her that the landscaping out there was done right. And so really, what harm would there have been? Because it was, you know, either DJ, my brother, or one of my cousins that was doing it and taking her and letting her pick out the flowers that got planted there.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, at one point in time, her physical therapist did do that. There was just a little garden place, and she took her, and Mom went out, and, you know, Mom wasn't able to get down on all fours and plant them. She was able to sit there on our walker and talk about it. And then when she told the story to me, she said, yeah, we planted them.
Yes.
And, you know, that was living her life. That was an everyday activity. And so, you know, if you're listening and you're caring for somebody, I'd urge you to, like, just stop 2 seconds and say, you know, what are these everyday activities that you're doing that around them that they could be doing? And even if they can only get to 75% of it, or, you know, maybe it is an extra burden to take them out and have them be part of it. But if you're letting them live their life, isn't that what we should be doing?
When I think, the Nan example with the landscaping is so important. It was just important to her that she was a part of the conversation.
Yes.
And so when we talk about no, I don't want Nan, bending over and planting flowers, but I could get her a chair and she could sit there and I could talk to her.
And she certainly could pick which flowers. She knew a lot about which flowers made the most sense in the area that we were doing. Was it shaded? Was it not? But everybody has these things, things that they did for work. Even I think back at my stepdad when he was sick, I would often talk to him about my business as I was building my business. And I started talking to him about that just because I needed something to talk to him about while I was laying there. But it ended up being that he was extremely helpful to me. And so, that's really just an everyday activity in some ways. But I think for what we're saying is it is a mindset that let them live their life in whatever way that was to the best possible. Because when we take that away, we're actually in some ways causing more risk and uncertainty. And so we're going to go through a list that we made, the attorneys that were there. And the first one is that, what we just went over, include your loved one in everyday activities, grocery shopping, cooking, folding clothes, setting the table, getting their hair done, all really important. And that's something we can do anywhere we are. The second, take your loved one for a walk or a car ride.
And I think about, it's funny, we talk about landscaping. That was so important to Nan. So she grew up on a farm, but also, my entire life lived on this beautiful farmhouse. And, I remember, mowing the lawn was so important to her, but the landscaping and all of that stuff. And, when she moved into the village, we paid different people to do that. But she always wanted to know what they were doing because that was still her house.
Yeah.
And, so you could, take her to fill it up and let her get an ice cream cone and drive her around and let her see what other people were doing. And it's funny, sometimes she had some opinions about how other people were choosing to decorate their homes.
Brown mulch versus, dark black mulch. Black mulch is a newer thing in her world. That was a bit concerning to her.
Well, but then it was something that you would take her to do it. She would call me and talk to me about it. And then she would, somebody else, or I think, if you live in a community where Christmas lights are a really big deal. So if you celebrate Christmas and Christmas lights, there was this house in, South Williamsport where we lived, and she did not like how they did their lights. She thought it was, it was just too much. They were doing too many things. There was no theme. It was so not how she would have done it. And, half the time I took her by that house just because it gave her something to talk about for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Right? And so,
maybe not the most positive energy, but.
No, but she was entertained.
Yeah.
Right? And it got her away from the TV. And, if you live in an area where it's starting to get nice outside or different things like that, depending on where you are in the country, just getting some fresh air, rolling down the windows and letting her see what's happening. There's always different construction and landscaping was important to her. And there are things like that are important to each different person. So, I don't personally ever want to drive around and see how people are landscaping. I just don't have those big opinions about mulch that she did. So, please don't do that for me. But for her, that was, so it's about finding the right things. And the risk of doing that activity was so low, right? Mm-hmm. So we used her walker. We put her in her car and we drove her around. But it got her out, it got her fresh air, and it gave her something to then talk to different people about for a couple of days.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just, I think also, if you're listening and your loved one has dementia, sometimes what can happen, dementia is just a very generic term. It can include Alzheimer's. It can include multi-infarct dementia, a lot of different types of things. It's kind of an umbrella term. But, sometimes when you're dealing with that disease, what happens is your loved one wants to go home and they may already be in their home. I'd encourage you, lean into that. Say, okay, put them in the car and drive them around and you can bring them right back. That happened a lot with my father-in-law, and the first response is often to say, well, you are home. Well, clearly in his mind, he wasn't, clearly he wasn't. And so you could fight that. But if you want to go home, you want to go home, right? That's a really hard thing to fight. And so I'd encourage people, what I said to my husband once when they were dealing with it, I was like, well, let's go get him. Let's take him for a ride. And we did. We went and showed him his brother's new house and just took a little ride. And we came back home to the same place we had picked him up that he didn't think was home. He was just all excited. He was like, oh, that was nice. Thanks for bringing me home. It's like, yeah. So that kind of redirecting, and I think it is important getting out of whatever place they are, whether it's a house or a community. I think it's good for everybody to be able to, if you've ever, had a medical issue and been in your house for a while, or even let's take the years of COVID, how nice it is just to get out. And I think sometimes we don't realize how helpful it is just to get out, a walk, a car ride. And walking, obviously also adds, that physical activity. And it's something that if younger people are caregiving, it's an activity that they can do quite easily. And so, so taking your loved one for a walk or a car ride is, again, simple, but something we'd encourage people to do. And also does help with the sleeping later, because even if they're just sitting in the car, they're engaging. They're more mentally tired. They've engaged a different part of their mind, and so they've also had a different day, which I think is really important. Yeah, absolutely. And the third one is to play games or cards with your loved one like they used to play.
And I think for this one, I think back to my grandfather who had dementia. We play a very regional card game called Setback, which is a very central Pennsylvania game. And, I think...
You've learned that since you've went other places and nobody plays it.
Nobody really knows how to play. But, I think for my grandfather, one of the things was that, when his dementia was progressing, he still really could play Setback. And it is a semi-complicated game. There's a lot of rules. There's some strategy. You have to really pay attention. You have to know what other people have. And so we did get to the point where he wasn't able to continue to play that. But I would say that he played for a very long time.
Oh, absolutely. He played much longer than if you had tried to have a conversation with him.
Yes.
You would have thought that he would be able to do it. But those the learned, patterns and behaviors. And, in some types of dementia, it's like a recorder going backwards. And, if he started playing that really early in life, it's something that would, very much keep with him. And so I think it is important to think about games, cards, anything that they used to do to pass the time. That's also good because it's mentally stimulating and gets them to continue to use their brain. And that's true for any diagnosis, because it's not just about physically doing something, it's about engagement and not just, being there and not being engaged. And so I think important for us to be thinking about. The next one is listen to music with your loved one. And boy, they showed a video at the Village where somebody who really was nonverbal, not interacting, was given an iPod with some music and was singing along and, just so engaged. And then after the music was removed, was continued to talk, and continued to engage. And that was just so powerful.
And I think, when I even think back to our own journey in caregiving too, Nan played the piano.
Yes, she did.
For a really long time. And that's how she kind of worked through things. And you could kind of hear her emotions based on how hard.
Oh, yes. When I was a kid and she was banging that piano, it was like, oh, she's in a mood.
But I think, it was something she brought her piano with her to the Village, and you would hear her, and I can remember just sitting there and listening to her work out the changes in her life in the piano, or around holidays and different things like that. We would bring the recording of church, and she could hear the choir, and that was really important to her. And so I think music has such different aspects for different people, but it can be a really powerful tool in kind of filling the space.
Yeah, and I remember, with Mom, that's even something that, like, I wasn't having her play the piano. She had 2 rooms, and it was the other room. And one time, again, asking for help, as we've talked about on here, I was away, and Buddy was away, and I needed somebody to stay with her. And actually, the cook at the Village, the head of the dietary department, who she had befriended after if you listen to the other episodes, she thought for sure she was being, poisoned. But that person had become good friends with Mom, and I had asked her to stay overnight with Mom, and she got her up the next morning and had Mom play the piano. See, I had forgotten, I'm so into what do we need to do, but right. Mel had her play the piano, and Mom so enjoyed that. Music is just such an important part of our lives. It engages a different part of our brain. I know even when my mom was passing, I made for sure that, we put on music that she really liked. And that filled the space for her and for us in a lot of ways. I encourage people, too, if you're caring for your loved one and, you're taking them to a doctor's appointment, don't put the music on the radio that you like. Put the music on the radio that the person that you're caring for likes. And that took me a while to get there with that. Yeah. To be honest with you, where I was like, oh, I don't want to listen to that music. And then, that was one of the things in my transition of leaning into, well, if that's what she wants, and then I'd be taking her to the doctors, and while she's looking at everybody's mulch, I can hear her humming along to the music, and it just was nicer for her. I will say, music is definitely used to calm down behaviors, and I would just, encourage everybody, if music isn't being part of the life, add it. It's we're always taking away. Add some music and add that in all of this, and see how your loved one reacts.
So I think, this podcast episode, we kind of set up the Dementia Village, and we talked about all of just a couple of the things that we learned that are really activity based, right? This is about really going back to basics and adding back in, your everyday, your normal, but there's so much more that we learned. And so we've decided to kind of split this episode into 2 parts. And so, next time we'll be back with more things that we learned from the Village, which were just phenomenal, but kind of talk a little bit more about maybe some of the medical things. This was really, kind of about the activities and how you're spending time and things like that. So I would encourage our listeners, if they haven't already, to go ahead and rate and comment, and then to follow along with us on Instagram and TikTok and Facebook at the Hey Woman Podcast. And if you're somebody who's looking for an attorney like the ones that went to the Village, who are forward thinking and really looking to kind of change the way that we think about care, the Planning and Protecting website has a lot of great like-minded attorneys if you're looking for somebody in your local area, or you're looking for some resources on how to really get started. And so we hope that this episode has provided a couple of actionable things that you can really take to change the way that you think about caregiving. And we'll be back next time with even more things to really change the way that we're thinking about it.
Yeah, we just thank everybody for opening up their lives, a little bit of space to let us in and share with you.